All right. Chapters 2 and 3 of Dracula. It looks like a bunch of you have gotten that far or farther, so let's talk about them both. What happens in these two chapters? It's still just Dracula and Jonathan Harker, though we meet some other characters later on, which we'll get to. But what are the main events? If we're going to summarize, remember, summarize just the facts, just the main events, then we're going to say that Jonathan Harker realizes that he is alone and imprisoned in the castle. He begins to realize that Dracula is not human, and some very strange things start happening. So this is the turn, I guess you'd say, of the story, where what we've seen and known almost from the beginning, right, is now Jonathan's mind is starting to work these things out. And remember that this is, I think, 1893. It's a time before, popular vampire culture that we have today. And vampires have been around for centuries as, scary stories and superstitions and, word of mouth. But here, Bram Stoker is making them public. He's, in a sense, creating the modern vampire with his reinvention of some of these old stories, and some of it I think he just makes up because he's a writer. That's what he does. But it's stuck with us as part of, the Dracula / vampire that we're familiar with. So things like the crucifix keeping him safe. The villagers give him garlic, right? That's another one. So we start to see these things that might not have meant anything to a Victorian audience start to become sinister. So just like in the first chapter where it starts out, he's beautiful landscape that he's visiting and he's enjoying the locals, and it gets darker and darker and darker and scarier and sinister. Now that he's there for a while, he's catching on to this. So, let's talk about dichotomies. As I said before, there are a lot of dichotomies in this work. And a dichotomy, just to refresh your brain, is when there are two things and nothing in the middle. So people say, it's either this or it's that. It's either black or white. It's either good or bad, good or evil, right? So that's a dichotomy. One dichotomy that we're seeing a lot of in these chapters is the old versus the new. Dracula is very concerned with his history. He traces his ancestry back to Attila the Hun and all these, ancient people. And he's proud of that. He's proud of his ancestry. He's proud of the influence he once had in the past. He's sort of fallen from grace in a way in this current century because he used to be in charge of, we're told, lots of lands and lots of people. And we realize, before Jonathan realizes, that that's what he's here to do. He's here to get that back, and he's chosen England as the land that he's going to take over. And it's interesting when he's talking, I think that was actually in chapter 1. I can't keep them straight, 1 and 2. But he was talking about learning the English language with Jonathan. And Jonathan says, "Oh, but you speak English so well." And he says, "Yes, but I don't want to sound like a stranger in a strange land." And you'll know if you've looked at the Course Hero stuff, that's a quote from the book of Exodus in the Bible. It's about Moses. Moses, you may know, you may not know, was raised as a prince in Egypt, as you can see in the animated movie The Prince of Egypt. And he's put into exile because he actually murders someone. And then many, many, many years later, while he's a stranger in a strange land in exile, that's where that quote comes from. He comes back and brings his people, and they make the Exodus journey with the Red Sea parting and all of that. But that story, it's part of this old new, because it's old, it's very old, and it's really something that Dracula would feel kinship to. He's used to being a prince, and now he only controls a few people. He's only him, and we find 3 other vampires living in this castle, and they don't have a lot of influence. They don't have a lot of slaves. They don't have all these things that he wants, that he remembers from way back when he was a prince. So he wants to bring his people back and settle them in a new land. So it's very much like Moses. So that's Bram Stoker's, he's an intelligent guy. He put that in there so that we could make that connection based on our prior knowledge, if you have the prior knowledge of Exodus, which you might not. But in the time that he's writing, the readers definitely would have. So, yeah, that's Dracula. He's interested in the old ways. You'll notice he takes the carriage instead of something new like the train. He takes, in the future of the book, he takes a ship instead of, a sailing ship, instead of a more modern sort of, what do I want to say? They're probably steam-powered ships. He just goes with the regular old sailing vessel. So he's interested in old things because that's what he's used to. He's an old creature. And Jonathan is interested in the new things. He's just been told that he is a full solicitor or lawyer, and he has a camera which was just invented, but he says he used his Kodak to take some pictures of the place, and that's really new for this time period. And just things he says and his attitude towards life, he wants the new things in life. He looks at the future as a time of industry and knowledge coming to men, and Dracula, he just wants the old ways back. So that's the old new dichotomy. They're one character on each side, and there's nothing in the middle. There's no middle ground for them. It's one or the other. That's what makes it a dichotomy. Another dichotomy here is between the city and the wilderness. Jonathan comes from, he doesn't come from in London, but he comes from England and from a city in England. So he's sort of a city guy. And here he is at Count Dracula's castle, which is, if you read the carriage ride, it's way out there in, the middle of the forest and the top of this big cliff. It's not easy to get to. It's out in the wilderness. And Dracula plays into that as well because he's connected to these things in the wilderness. We actually get animal imagery being used to describe Dracula in these chapters. One of my favorite visualizations from this book, there's a few, but one of my favorite is the time he sees Dracula crawling down the wall, the outside wall of the castle. And he says, he went as quick and sure as a lizard. So he's comparing him to a lizard. Then he describes the way his cloak was behind him, like bat wings. We all know vampires are connected to bats. And then we've got, the children of the night, the wolves, that Dracula is sort of master over, it seems. He can command them and control them. So that's all very, wilderness, forest, animals. And Jonathan is a city guy. He's got high-tech equipment like a camera. And he's not used to this. So, he just wants to get back to London. And we're going to see, the ways that Dracula then becomes a stranger in a strange land, going into a modern city like London. That hasn't happened yet. The third and final dichotomy that I want to talk about here is, again, the Ave Eva. Refresh your memory. The Ave Eva dichotomy says that there are only two kinds of women. There are your virtuous, good, proper, virginal women, and then there are sexualized, sexually active, evil women. And there's nothing in the middle, right? That's a dichotomy that's really present in Victorian culture at this time. But you really get a picture of that as he writes to his fiancée, Mina Murray, who is one of these very proper, very innocent young ladies in England. But in the castle, he comes across, or they come across him actually, these three, what people call the brides of Dracula. These three women who are sort of ghosts, but sort of vampires, and we're not sure exactly what they are. But if you read those sections, the language is very sexual. And again, that would be a big deal at this time that the book was written. So these women are shown to be sexual and evil. They want to eat him, basically. They want to consume him. So that connection of the vampiric with the sexual with the evil, those three linked together, is an important theme throughout the book. But here's where we really see it for the first time. Mina Murray back home in England, waiting for her fiancé to return, and these three, voluptuous women who Jonathan has, wicked desires stir within him, and they almost eat him until Dracula comes and says, "Hey, what are you doing eating my lawyer?" Basically. So those are ways in which some of the dichotomies we've mentioned are developed in these two chapters. And yeah, leave it at that for now. Dichotomies. We've got the old and the new, the city and the wilderness, and the Ave Eva.